My name is David Jenneman. I am the Dean of the Patrick Leahy Honors College. I am delighted to welcome you all here to the inaugural Leahy Public Policy Forum, looking back on Vietnam. As I look at some of our distinguished guests this evening, Senator Leahy, Senator Welch, Ambassador Zung, our speaker this evening, David Moranis, I realize that I am the only guy that didn't get the memo that you didn't have to wear a tie. So I'll correct that tomorrow when I see you at the forum events. My job this evening is to be host and MC, so I won't be talking too much. And the other part of my job is to introduce someone very special to the university. I would like to be able to say that I am the first person who gets to introduce Patty Prelock as interim president of the university, but I know that she has already been at a couple of events today, and knowing Patty, she will likely go to 2 or 3 events this evening, and I'll just be one in a steady stream of people introducing Patty, who is one of our favorite people. But Patty Prelock is the interim president of the university as of midnight last night, and she is a recognized expert in the nature and treatment of autism spectrum disorders and has been awarded more than $23 million in university, state, and federal funding as a PI or co-PI to develop innovations in interdisciplinary training supporting children and youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities and their families, and to facilitate training in speech-language pathology, and to support her intervention work in ASD. She has over 206 publications and 584 peer-reviewed and invited presentations or keynotes in the areas of autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. She has served as the dean of our College of Nursing and Health Sciences for the past 5 years. She has served as our provost at the University of Vermont. We began our tenure, I as dean and she as provost, at roughly the same time. And as of this morning, she is now the acting president of the University of Vermont. I'm delighted to welcome our friend, Madam President, to the stage.
Thank you so much, David. I should have told him, cut it after, here's Patty. It is so wonderful to be here, and Senator Welch, Ambassador Zung, Mr. Moranis, our distinguished guests, and especially our dear Patrick and Marcel Leahy, who have been friends and colleagues and people that I adore. And by the way, Marcel's a nurse, so I have a special feeling in my heart for her. This is really a special evening tonight, truly a special education as we pay tribute to the work that Senator Leahy has done. He's had one of the most impactful and distinguished public policy careers in the history of Vermont and in our country. And as today's program shows, one of the most impactful people in the 20th century global affairs. So thank you, Patrick. So we always claim Senator Leahy as one of our Catamount family, but we haven't really let him retire yet, even though I know Marcel was hoping that this was retirement. And in fact, he's become a President's Distinguished Fellow, and wherever he and Marcel go, they bring a special light to our community, to our students, to our faculty, to our staff. They are part of our Catamount family. They were before, and now they're ever so much that important legacy for us. You know, the legacy that Senator Leahy has brought in Vermont and at UVM is immense. He is responsible for more funding to support UVM programs than we can count, including the transformative endowment he directed to UVM just last year in the Senate to advance academic excellence, which I know is so important to him across the university and especially our Patrick Leahy's Honors College. And we just were able to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Patrick Leahy Honors College this past weekend. We had an incredible UVM weekend with family, parents, alumni, and it was so great to have Marcel and Patrick celebrate that with us. And I suspect 20 years ahead are even more exciting than the past. And just before I came here, I was at an event with over 200 students and their families who are our Green and Gold Scholars, who are the top students in Vermont, who will be automatically invited to the Patrick Leahy Honors College. And it's just our continued commitment to excellence for our students. And my goal was to commit them to coming to UVM, and so I did a little magic trick as well. Tonight marks a unique opportunity for our campus and our community to really explore Senator's remarkable global legacy and to understand the complexity of war, conflict, and repair specific to Vietnam and applicable to so many circumstances in the 50 years since the Senator cast the deciding vote to end the U.S. involvement in that war. As the wife of a Marine who served in Vietnam, I appreciate the steps taken by the Senator that brought my husband home. Especially knowing the complexities of that time, and he would be here, but he has the flu. And he was not happy about not being able to share this time, so I told him I would take good notes. Today's lecture and tomorrow's panels are a critical opportunity for understanding and so closely aligned with our university mission. We are pleased to host this public policy forum and grateful to David, thank you, and to all of our panelists for sharing their experience and their wisdom with us over the next 2 days. Thank you. And thanks to all in attendance. This is so exciting to see so many students and community members, faculty, staff, alumni. I really appreciate it. Special thanks to the staff and friends of Senator Leahy to help make this happen, and to the incredible UVM students of the Patrick Leahy Honors College for joining us to listen, learn, and understand our shared history. Now, I understand from your dean that he said this is an expectation, but I know you are here because you want to learn and engage. So now I'm going to invite my dear friend, special friend to me, who will always have a special place in my heart, our beloved Senator Patrick Leahy, to share his thoughts and insights.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I enjoy calling you that. It's actually, oh no, I'm not going to get political, but it's a nice word, Madam President. I want to thank the university. I think a few people caught that one. I know it took the hard work of many here at UVM to do this. And David, I appreciate what you have done. I want to welcome everybody here. I'm glad to see my successor in the Senate, Peter Welch, who has far more energy and can do a lot more than I did. So if you have any problems, just call him. I'll give you his cell phone number afterward. But I also want to especially thank Ambassador Zung and his wife, Ms. Van. They're very good friends. We are honored to welcome to Vermont, and and we've been honored that they refer to us as Uncle Patrick and Aunt Marcel, which is really nice. You know, many in this room, the Vietnam War occurred before you were born. Maybe people of my generation, like we might read about Pearl Harbor, you might read the same way about Vietnam. For others, it's a fading memory. But those who lived through it, in that tumultuous period, both on this campus and in Vietnam, so many Vermonters, it's affected us in profound ways that will remain with us throughout our lives. John Tracy ran my Vermont office, fought in Vietnam, and came back for his first time with Marcel and myself to Da Nang. Next April, it's going to be 50 years since the end of the war. I remember that very well. I remember when we voted to end it, vote after vote after vote, each time ending by cutting out the war by one vote. And I remember the chairman of the committee saying, better call the president. His war is over. It should have been over years before. But the people who understand it as well as anybody here, David Marinas, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his national reporting. I've heard him speak several times. We've talked about this. Marcel and I have read his book. There's been so many other books he's written. I did get a kick out of reading your first in the class, the best-selling biography of Bill Clinton. Luke Albee tells me that Bill loved to read some parts of it to his staff, and other parts he didn't like, he wouldn't read. Is that correct? But he wrote one of the finest books about Vietnam. This is the one that everybody, no matter what your position on it, you can read and understand. They marched into sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967. It's what happened on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, where David was a freshman at the time. I am glad he's here. And I'd add tomorrow David and Greg, where are you? Oh, right here. Who's a leader of Students Against the War at Harvard University. He's a good friend of Marcel's and mine, and Luke Albee, Tim Reeser. He's going to speak. But David, thank you for coming to Vermont. We've tried to have the foliage be appropriate. Actually, President Prelock stopped the rain so you could walk around outside. And thank you for coming. Please join us all.
Wow, this is great. And thank you for having me here on this spectacular fall day. It's just been a delight for me. Thank you, Senator Leahy, President Prelock, Ambassador Zung, and Madam Vaughn, and all the guests and participants in this forum, and especially to the students. I had the opportunity today to speak to students twice, and it's a terrific school with great students, and I feel better about the future every time I'm on a college campus. And I really feel honored to be part of this, and I'm grateful to Senator Leahy and his incredible staff, led by Tim Reeser, for all the important work that they've done in dealing with the after effects of this difficult and misbegotten war. I'm a reporter and author. I'm not a politician or a soldier or an activist. My connection to Vietnam comes through my work. From the years I spent researching and writing, they marched into sunlight. I've now written 13 books, and I'm working on the 14th. But no other book has had the psychological effect on me that this one did, and of more importance, helped change the lives of the soldiers that I wrote about, who were longing for the truth. When I found it, they made me an honorary member of the Black Lions Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division. Many of the figures in this book have died in the 2 decades since it came out. They survived the worst that man could do to man, but they couldn't survive the effects of the Agent Orange and the over-adrenalized year they spent in combat. Many of them died too young of bladder cancer and other cancers whose causes likely go back to their time in country. But the larger issues that are addressed in the book are still and always here. The issues of war and peace. What is a just war? What's an unjust war? To what ends? What are the rationales for starting a war? And how do you end war? What does it mean to be an American? What's the role of dissent and consent in American life? And even in times as divided as those and as divided as they are now, also the question of the commonality of the human experience. There have been 2 documentaries made from the stories of They Marched into the Sunlight. No feature film yet. My line about that is all of my books are in various stages of not being made into movies. But the book did inspire a modern dance, a beautiful, evocative expression. And one of the documentaries made from the book examines how that was done, how a book was turned into a dance. Maybe the most interesting of all the languages that my books have been translated into. All right. And I'll show 2 short segments from that documentary tonight. My interest in Vietnam was generational. I'm a baby boomer, born in the years after World War II. Vietnam became a central part of our lives when we reached young adulthood. It dominated the daily discussions. Will I go? Will I serve? Will I resist? Will I go to prison? Is it a just war? A war worth risking your life for? Before the era of the volunteer army, there were still vast inequities in who served and who did not, and differences in the options young men had. But it was still something that every one of us had to deal with in some fashion, as did our parents, our siblings, our wives and girlfriends. All social movements are some mix of idealism and self-interest, and that was the case for the anti-war movement in the Vietnam era. When researching and writing 2 of my earlier books, the biographies of Bill Clinton and Vince Lombardi, and you can't imagine 2 more unalike figures, I realized that when I came to the 1960s, in each of those books, I slowed down and became more obsessed because it resonated in my life. So I decided I should just write a book about Vietnam. I knew there was great literature about the war in Vietnam, from A Bright Shining Lie to The Best and the Brightest to The Things They Carried. Not such great literature about the anti-war. And I hadn't seen a book that tried to put these 2 worlds together into one narrative. 2 very different worlds that were nonetheless really about the same thing. And between those 2 worlds, I wanted to explore what was going on in Washington with Lyndon Johnson and his war cabinet, trying to deal with both of those very different worlds and flailing at both. I started with something from my own experience. I was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin in the fall of 1967 when there was a protest that October against Dow Chemical Company, makers of napalm and Agent Orange. I watched as students filed into the Commerce Building for what they thought would be an act of civil disobedience, a civil rights style sit-down strike in the hallways to try to prevent the Dow recruiters from entering the building. I watched as a platoon of Madison police officers, who proudly called themselves later the Dirty 30, came onto the campus, huddled across the street from the Commerce Building below the Carillon Tower, and then marched into the building wielding their billy clubs, glass breaking, heads bashing, screams, students with bloodied heads and bruised backs. It was the first anti-war demonstration on a college campus that turned into a violent confrontation, a sort of police riot. And I chose that time as I wanted to frame the book around. The fall of 1967 was right after the Summer of Love and the rise of the counterculture, and before the Tet Offensive. The world was spinning faster, changing week by week. Everything seemed up in the air, unsettled and unresolved. No one knew what would happen next, with the war or with their lives. So I started with that, the Dow protest. Then I went to the library at the Washington Post, where I've worked for 47 years, and asked a simple question. What was going on in Vietnam around that time, the 17th and 18th of October, 1967? I got out the microfilm in the Post library and rolled through it and found a battle, an unnamed battle, in which 60 US soldiers were killed and a similar number wounded out of a unit of about 140 men. 2 small companies and a command group. The battle was in the Long Wind Secret Zone near the Ontan Stream, 44 miles northwest of Saigon, toward the Cambodian border. The troops were from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. They were the Black Lions, the 2nd of the 28th Regiment, working out of a base in Leahy. Think about it. 60 men killed. And yet, unlike the wars later in Iraq and Afghanistan, this number barely registered a tremor, barely caused a ripple. It prompted a story of a few paragraphs in the New York Times and Washington Post, and one mention on the CBS Evening News, and only warranted that much coverage because of the illustrious backgrounds of 2 of the men killed in the battle, Donald Hollader and Terry De La Mesa Allen Jr. Hollader was a major then. He'd been an All-American football player at West Point in the early 1950s. He starred as an end on the Army teams, but was such a fearless leader that the coach, Red Blake, moved him to quarterback his senior year because of his charismatic leadership skills. Even though he couldn't throw a lick, his passes went end over end. But he ran like a wild Mustang, his knees churning so high that it was tough to tackle. And this is how he died that October morning in Vietnam. He was in a helicopter flying over the jungle battlefield when he heard the despair of what was happening below, directed the chopper to land, and went charging in to help, and was felled by a single bullet as he was running down a ravine. Something else about Hollader that showed me I was fated to do this story, perhaps. When he was at West Point, one of the coaches under Red Blake was Vince Lombardi. And among the boxes of archival material that I collected when researching the Lombardi biography was a prayer card that Lombardi kept of Donald Hollader after his death. At the time, I knew nothing about Hollader. I didn't know that he'd been killed in Vietnam or that I would write about it someday. Then there was Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr., also killed in the battle. He was the battalion commander, the son of terrible Terry Allen, the famed World War II general who led American troops in North Africa and Sicily and France. By 1967, the old man was retired and living in El Paso. He had the onset of dementia and was living through his namesake son, a West Point graduate who seemed destined to rise to become a general himself. But all wasn't well in the young life of Terry Allen. His wife back in El Paso, a former Sun Queen, had turned against the war and didn't want to be an officer's wife anymore, and had written Allen increasingly disillusioned letters that amounted to what were called Dear John letters. He was distraught enough that he went home earlier that fall to Texas on emergency leave. He had 3 young daughters. The oldest, Consuelo, was barely 6. And she remembered for me a scene that was etched forever in her mind. Her father came by the house one day before he left, and she hid from him under a table, thinking that if he couldn't find her, he wouldn't leave and he wouldn't be killed in Vietnam. That fall of 1967 was a pivotal time in Washington and Vietnam. William Westmoreland, the commander of troops in Vietnam, was pushing for more and more men. The buildup had gone from 50,000 in 1965 to over 500,000, and Westmoreland wanted even more. He said that with more soldiers, he could win the war through battles of attrition, like General Grant in the Civil War. Search and destroy. Go out and find the enemy, fix it in place, and wipe it out. And the pressure came down from above, from Johnson in Washington to Westmoreland in Vietnam, to the colonels and lieutenant colonels and captains and lieutenants, all the way down to Terry Allen and the Black Lions. It was a foolhardy mission. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese knew every inch of land. It was their land. They were fighting on their home turf. On college campuses back home, tension was also building, especially on campuses like Wisconsin. The largest organization there in the fall of 1965, believe it or not, I was amazed to find this, were still the Young Republicans. But that was changing fast. There had been teach-ins against the war and its effects at the university since 1965. And one leader of those teach-ins was a great sociology professor named William Sewell, who by 1967 was the chancellor. The Dow protest put Sewell to the test. It became a Shakespearean tragedy of a good man caught in a difficult situation who made the wrong choices, or at least not the smart choices. And he failed in the crucible of pressure. He called the city police and brought them onto campus, but he'd not expected them to go into the Commerce Building with hard batons, clubbing and beating his students. And he was paralyzed when it happened. And he only watched with dismay through the back window at Bascom Hall as the chaos unfolded below him. When I interviewed William Sewell many decades later, he was 90 years old. And as he sat in his office in the sociology building, tears came to his eyes as he recalled that long ago day. The worst day of my life, he said. I didn't know how to stop it. Back in Vietnam, the pressure pounded down on Terry Allen to take his men into the field and search and destroy. But they were more confident than they should have been and walked into an ambush and were decimated. I'm going to show now a brief segment from the documentary Into Sunlight that incorporates a bit of the dance that the book inspired with memories from Consuelo Allen, the daughter of the battalion commander killed in the battle, and a soldier named Clark Welch, who was a company lieutenant commander and the hero of the book. Lieutenant Welch, who commanded Delta Company, had an instinctual feel that they should not make a direct assault that morning, but he failed to persuade Allen to change tactics. And none of them knew exactly what they were walking into, a three-sided ambush where the Americans were outnumbered 10-1.
My dad, Terry Allen Jr., was the battalion commander for the Black Lions, 228. So when David started researching the book, that's the battle that he focused on. And my father was killed in combat, he and 60 other men. I can remember my grandmother saying that it was like Custer's last stand.
Now, what we had done on the 16th was determined exactly where the enemy was. So I couldn't wait to get back to tell the colonel, face to face that, by God, sir, we got them now. We know where they are. And I said, sir, I was there today. I know what we're going to run into tomorrow. And I took the map that was sitting on his little table. I said, sir, they're right here. They're right here. We shouldn't walk that way. And he said, I'm the battalion commander, and we all know what we're going to do tomorrow. And I said, yes, sir.
What I didn't realize is that my father and Clark really didn't see eye to eye the night before the battle.
But the failure in the Battle of Vong Tan is that on the night of October 16th, sitting just the two of us in that tent, I could not find the words. Perhaps it's because I hadn't gone to West Point and the colonel had. Perhaps it was because he's the colonel and I'm just a lieutenant. He's a battalion commander, I'm a company commander. But whatever it was, I couldn't, they don't teach it anywhere in the Army or anywhere in the world, I guess. But there was no doubt he was saying, that's what we're going to do. I wasn't angry so much as I was just sad that we've missed an opportunity to defeat the enemy, this outfit we've been looking for. But the other thing that made me so sad was we're going to lose some people on this one. I haven't lost anybody yet, and we're going to lose some people on this one. It was hot, it was humid, it would rain every afternoon, and more or less, and when it rains, when the rain stops for another 2 or 3 or 4 hours, you've got water coming down. So it's miserable, but it's just miserable. That's what you got. It was exactly 10 o'clock. And then this tremendous burst of fire from my right and my front. I couldn't see where it was coming from. They were just bullets ripping overhead. But it was just a absolute burst of fire, the noise, the trees getting knocked down. The firing kept going, I don't know for how long, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Most of it was coming in. We couldn't see the enemy. So they were underneath us, running around, popping up, firing at us, popping up, firing at us. Just fire, fire, fire. We were ambushed by people waiting for us on 3 sides. It wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. All I knew was that there was a hell of a lot of enemy. I didn't expect 1,200 when I found out later on that it was 1,200 people shooting at us. I couldn't believe it. I remember seeing the nurse and walking up to her and saying, "Where's my Delta? Where's my Delta?" And then she said, "Your Delta's gone." She said, "Your Delta's gone." I remember that. And then I remember that I collapsed.
I have tremendous respect for what he did that day, and I think in large part to what he did that day, a lot of men owe him their lives.
I think about that probably every day. That on the 17th, there is no doubt that all of my soldiers did the best they could, and I did the best I could on the 17th. Couldn't have asked any of my men to do anything more than they did. I could not possibly have done any more than I did.
And I know it's taken a long time for him, and I think he's, come to some kind of reconciliation about what happened that day.
As it happened, just as the Black Lions were marching into the sunlight and then into the forest, a stand of rubber trees, that fateful morning, LBJ was meeting with his war cabinet in the White House. There was a vast time difference between Vietnam and Washington, so that it was 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning in Vietnam and 9 the night before in Washington. And at one point in that meeting, LBJ turned to Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, and asked, "How are we ever going to win this war?" Part of the tragedy is that both men already knew they could not win. There were about 12,000 American troops killed by that point, and it would rise to a total of nearly 60,000, along with millions of Vietnamese before it was over. It was the next day after the battle in Vietnam and the protest in Madison that LBJ was in the Situation Room in the White House, and a messenger came in to deliver a message to Johnson and the War Council. And the message told Johnson about this battle in Vietnam and the protests and the outbreak of violence on the Wisconsin campus. Clark Welch had fought valiantly that day, saving many of his men, but he was haunted by the loss and the devastation for decades afterwards. It took me 2 years of work to get him to agree to talk to me about it. He was hiding up in the hills of Colorado, still afraid that some mother or sibling or daughter or son would hold him accountable for the death of their loved one, even though he was not responsible. When he finally agreed to talk to me, we met at a hotel in Denver. I didn't realize it, but as a former Green Beret, Clark had scouted me out for half an hour before I even knew he was there. And when he sat down, he said to me, "David, I'll agree to talk to you if you promise to be good to my boys." And I said, "Colonel Welch, I can't make that promise." If I do and I find something difficult about that battle, if I don't write about it, I'm betraying the truth. And if I do write about it, after making that promise, I'd be betraying you. He got up from the table and said, no, that's not good enough. You have to be good to my boys. And I repeated what I had said. And I said as well, Colonel Welch, I will promise you that there'll be no games, that I will let you know everything I'm finding, and I will search for the truth and let you know exactly what it is. And he finally agreed to talk, and that made all the difference. We developed a very close relationship. He eventually gave me 60 of the letters that he'd written home to his wife, Leahy, during that year that he was in Vietnam. And then he understood what I was trying to do. And here are some of the things I found out that I told Clark Welch about later. The 1st Infantry Division commander, General Leahy, was not in the battle. He had arrived hours later, and all he did was ream out the soldiers for losing. Yet he was given a Silver Star for that incident. It's sort of a form of stolen valor. When I told the soldiers who'd survived that battle that, you can imagine the profound anger and effect that had on them. I also found out that Westmoreland's men called the battle an American victory. They could not lose when they had this concept of winning through battles of attrition, search and destroy missions. It would hurt their cause, and especially at a time when they were trying to get more men. So they made up a body count. I found a report by an oral historian who was sent up to Leahy, their base camp right after the battle, and he studied what had happened. And he found out that immediately after the battle, Westmoreland's men had asked the soldiers, well, how many Viet Cong dead did you see? And you would say 10, and you would say 10, and you would say 10, and they'd add them all up to over 100 plus, saying that they won the battle, when in fact, those were the same 10 bodies over and over again. And I also found out that some of Clark Welch's men did respond heroically, and some did not. That's the way it is. That's the reality. I'll never forget interviewing, decades later, a soldier named Tom Colburn when I was researching the book. He was 18 years old in Vietnam. So young they gave him the nickname Baby Son. His hands were shaking as I approached him. He was holding a glass of water, and the water was spilling on the floor, jiggling out of his glass. And he said that when he was in the battle, there were enemy soldiers tied by ropes up in the trees. And he was directly under the tree, and they couldn't see him. And one of his fellow soldiers was in the sunlight 5 yards away, asking for help. And Tom Colburn said that he froze. He was afraid if he moved to help his fellow soldier, he'd be shot and killed. He was paralyzed. Imagine being put in that position when you're 18 years old. No young person should have to face that dilemma. And Tom Colburn never recovered psychologically from that trauma. Before my research was over, Clark gave me all those letters, and then he agreed to go to Vietnam with me in a group that also included Consuelo Allen, the daughter of the battalion commander killed in the battle. We arrived in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, in late January of 2002. I hoped for two things: to get to the battlefield and to find some of the Viet Cong who fought on the other side. I knew that it was the 1st Viet Cong Regiment, and I had learned from several reports that the name of the regimental commander was Vo Minh Triet. I gave that name to my Vietnamese handler from their version of the State Department, Madam Ha, and 2 days later she called me and she said, surprisingly, we found your man. Vo Minh Triet is living in Ho Chi Minh City. He's in charge of population control in Ward 13. So we met the next day, Triet sat across the table from Clark and me, and 2 interpreters were also there. And I have to confess, I was afraid to ask Triet about the battle right away, because I knew that the battles are chaos, and I don't even know if they called it a battle from their side of the war, because sides look at things so differently. So I spent the first several hours just talking to him about his life, how he'd grown up in the South and moved north in 1963 and came down south again. He moved north in 1953 and came down south again in 1963 along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to lead this Viet Cong regiment. And finally, after getting his life story, I pulled out a map that showed the Long Nguyen secret zone where this was happening. And he stood up and he was wearing a really finely starched white shirt and a bolo tie with the North Vietnamese insignia. There were no markings on the map, and he pointed directly where the battle happened and said, "We weren't supposed to be there. Let me tell you how it happened. We weren't supposed to be there," he said. "We were supposed to be closer to the Cambodian border with orders to take part in another planned battle. But we were starving. We had no food. We'd been eating stinkweed for 2 weeks until we found this base camp, Rear Service Group 83, that had food. It had rice. So we were restoring ourselves. And then we heard and saw this heavy American unit clanging around in the jungle. So we waited and set up an ambush. We had riflemen tied up in the trees. We set up claymore mines. We had them walk into a 3-sided trap, and they would wait for my signal. And this haunted me when he said it. The signal was 3 knocks on a piece of wood. And I already knew that one of the American soldiers, an African-American, Sergeant Johnson, loved soul music. And he would walk into the jungle every day singing Eddie Floyd's Knock on Wood. And that was the signal for the Viet Cong. The next day after Triet told his story, we all piled into a van and drove from Ho Chi Minh City up to the battlefield. Clark and me and Vo Minh Triet and Consuelo and her friend Rob and my wife Linda and Connie Debley from C-SPAN, who was filming about how I researched and reported a book. And as we approached near the battlefield, we found this farmhouse occupied by a man named Nguyen Van Lum. And it turned out that Lum had been there since the battle, that he had been part of that rear service group and took part in the battle, providing Triet with the food that his men needed. And Triet recognized him after 30-some years. They embraced. And Triet, who was in charge of population control, chewed out Lum because he had 10 kids. And they invited us for a lunch of squirrel, which I politely declined, said we weren't hungry. And then, while we were there, one of Lum's sons came in, missing his left arm. He'd lost it only a few years earlier, working in the manioc fields, when an American munition exploded. "You left this behind," Lum said to us matter-of-factly. The things we left behind. This is what Senator Leahy and his aide Tim Reeser worked so hard to deal with for so long. Not just the things they carried, as Tim O'Brien's brilliant books put it, but the things we left behind. During that same trip, my wife and I had flown to Hanoi and visited the Peace Village, a special school for young Vietnamese boys and girls, sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters of Vietnamese who were born with deformities as a result of the poisoning of their country by dioxins, by Agent Orange. They were beautiful children, the unwitting victims of the lasting remnants of a war. We left with a clay turtle, sea turtle that one of them had made and gave to my wife, and a beautiful watercolor painting done by a 13-year-old girl with misformed limbs. And it hangs today on my wall in Washington. The things we left behind. The base camp of the Black Lions in Leahy served a different purpose in the decades after the Americans left. When we visited Leahy, we were told it once housed hundreds of biracial Amerasians, the children of American soldiers who left them behind. They were children, in a sense, without a country. Bui Doi, they were called, the children of dust. Back to the battlefield. After spending time at Win Van Lem's house, we walked toward the battlefield. I had the coordinates, and Clark had a little GPS medallion around his neck. He was walking arm in arm with Vo Minh Triet, two old soldiers who had tried to kill each other decades earlier, and yet had this bond that was just so visible as they were walking together. Clark had learned a little Vietnamese, and Triet knew no English, but they were communicating, pointing out where each of them were during that horrible day. Finally, Clark asked me the coordinates, and then he said, "David, if we walk 100 yards to the left, that's where the heat of the battle was." Turning to Consuelo, he said, "That's where your father was killed." The GPS took us into a stand of rubber trees, and it was a soft winter day, sunlight dappling down through the rubber trees, leaves crunching underfoot. And I knew that Terry Allen had been killed while trying to take cover behind a 4-foot anthill. When we got to that spot, there was a 4-foot-high anthill. A different anthill, but the same anthill. Time compressed at that moment, history compressed. We were back to that awful day in that awful war. And as we stood there, Clark and Triet, who had fought against each other, Consuelo, who'd lost her father, and me and my wife, who'd been at Wisconsin and the anti-war movement, I was overwhelmed right then. It just washed over me. The commonality of the human experience. Part of that experience is a sense of loss and a shared sense of longing. And there's a scene in the dance conceived by New York choreographer Robin Becker that captures that in a way that words can't. Two dancers at a cemetery. One last image I want to leave you with. Several years before Clark Welch died, he came to Washington for a performance of Into Sunlight, this dance. And beforehand he said, Dave, I can't imagine turning that into a modern dance. And then he cried through the second half of the performance. And when it was over, he walked onto the stage, and the young dancers huddled around him. Loss, beauty, wistfulness, sorrow, love, respect, regret, pride, the continuity of life through generations. It was all there on that stage. Just as seeing Senator Leahy and Ambassador Zheng here tonight reminds us of hope and redemption. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that inspiring talk. And thank you, Senator Leahy, Ambassador Zung, for being here this evening. It really is what we hoped for this forum and for these events, to provide people the opportunity to gather together, to talk across years, across differences, and talk with one another. And tomorrow we will be doing the same at a series of panels. I do hope you will join us. I think we have time for a few questions this evening, David. There is a microphone circulating if people have questions. I'd ask that people keep their questions as questions, try to be succinct, so we can give plenty of people the opportunity to ask David what they would like to ask him.
The 8-second rule.
Yes.
Min Lee, I'm a professor at UVM and the son of Vietnamese refugees. I was just wondering, from your historical research and your interviews with participants in the war, what kind of lessons you gleaned for how we can avoid these types of conflicts in the future?
Yeah, I wish there were an answer to that question, because history doesn't repeat itself precisely, but it keeps recycling back over and over again. There are so many lessons from this particular war. They don't apply to all wars. But when this book came out, it was 2003, right when the United States was invading Iraq. And it was at a time when American soldiers were fighting in a land they didn't know the language or the culture. There were no front lines. They didn't know who was a friend or an enemy. And there were the same questions back home about the role of dissent in American life and how a war is started and how will it ever end. So I guess that shows you that lessons aren't always learned. But one can only hope that history takes one step back and two steps forward instead of the other way around, and that America finally learned the true lessons of Vietnam. One of the things you can say about the Vietnam War is that there was no Vietnam War to learn from before that. And in some ways, the American military thought they'd learned the lessons of Vietnam, but they learned the wrong lessons. And so they fell into a trap again.
Yes. side here. Wait, there's a microphone coming.
My wife and I were students at Wisconsin at that very time.
Oh, wow.
And I was living in the faculty dorm right across from the UVM Green, or right across from the Wisconsin Green. And the night before the Dow demonstration, I remembered I heard this chanting, a whole bunch of students. It was a panty raid.
Yes,
So the next
exactly.
the next day, I heard chanting again, but it was the response to what happened at the Commerce Building, a different kind of chanting, and there were never any more panty raids all the years that we were at Wisconsin.
That shows you how fast life was changing in that fall of 1967. You're absolutely right. Panty raids to protest.
Here in the front.
I have two questions, David. First of all, the fact that you delivered to us that in October of 1967, only 12,000 people had died.
Yeah, 12,000 Americans.
Americans,
Yeah.
I'm talking about 12,000 Americans had died. And that at that time, the President of the United States knew that the war was unwinnable.
Yes.
It occurs to me that what happened between October 1967 and the end of the war in 1975 increased the number of dead without any good justification, without any pretense, based on misrepresentations of what was happening, misrepresentations about what our national security interest was. And has there ever been adequate consequence for the people who made those decisions? You write about it in the book that Lyndon Johnson was focused on trying to deliver good news all the time,
Right.
and went out of his way to transform the reality into good news in order to sell the war. No consequence. And so the second question is, did the anti-war movement in Wisconsin and New York and California end the war, help end the war, or did it prolong the war? Those are the two questions.
Well, those, you could argue it either way, but it's apparent that, I mean, first of all, one consequence was that LBJ chose not to run again. And then, Bobby Kennedy was killed. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't been assassinated after Johnson went out. But then Richard Nixon was elected with a promise that he had a secret plan to end the war, which went on for all those more years. So perhaps, there are always unintended consequences in history. Who knows if Johnson hadn't stepped down, maybe he was on the way to ending the war. Maybe if John F. Kennedy hadn't killed him, wouldn't have started in the first place. Those are counterfactual questions that I can't answer. But I would never say that the anti-war movement then was counterproductive. It was the right position. Certainly every movement makes mistakes and gets, there's an overzealous part of that movement that can create problems. And right in 1968, there was so much other chaos going on, and Nixon was able to draw on that to get elected. And not just the war, but the racial situation in the United States. Another thing of history repeating itself, demonizing the other, which we see again today. So I have no problems with the position of the anti-war movement, whether it really ended the war or other factors ended the war more, including the end of the draft, the Vietnamization, quote unquote, which didn't really work and lasted for many years. But the U.S. was never going to win that war, and you're right, LBJ and McNamara knew it in 1967. And it kept going. I mean, that's the tragedy of it. I mean, that's one of the tragedies of it.
And thank you, David. I was with the Marines in Vietnam, and since I've gotten back, there's been a lot of news about veterans suffering and suicides.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, my question is, of the men, the Tiger Men, do you know if any of them died after they came home from suicide, which I think is actually brought about by what's called now moral injury,
Yes.
which I think the immorality of the war obviously would have been felt the most by people on the ground. So I'm curious if you know any of the men that you were researching.
There was a lot of PTSD among the men, not among all of them, but many of the men that I interviewed and spent time with were still psychologically traumatized by that moral injury, and also by something called survivor's guilt. Why did I survive that horrible ambush while the guy next to me was killed? So in one way or another, they were almost all haunted by it. And many of them died young. I don't know of any actual suicides from that group, but I do know a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them who suffered terribly psychologically because of it. And that's why this book, since they put so much trust in me, was, it was it had a psychological effect on me too. It was transferred as I was trying to tell their story. But I do not know of any, to be honest, I don't know of any who committed suicide. I know that that's sadly too common, but boy, did they suffer anyway, in different ways.
David, I'll ask one question and let people think if they have any more. It was a question actually that one of the students asked today when we met with them, and I thought it was very astute. And they said, "What are the commonalities you see between Wisconsin in 1967 and what we're seeing on campuses today?"
That is such a difficult. I mean, the 67 part is easy to answer. What's happening today is much more complicated. The commonality among the students, the vast majority of the students who were protesting then and are today, is that they're motivated by idealism. One of the differences is that the students of today, most of them, some of them are from Gaza or the Middle East and have relatives who are affected by it, or are Jewish students who have relatives in Israel. But for the most part, America is one more step removed from that. There is no draft. Americans are not fighting there. And so that sort of narrows it to a certain extent, whereas in that era, as I said, everybody was thinking about it every day, whether they were going to go or not. And this is somewhat different in that respect. Another similarity is that you see the horror on television. Vietnam was really the first televised war. And after that, the American government tried to repress it during Iraq, and you didn't see it. It was sanitized. But you're seeing it in Gaza, the devastation there. And you saw the horrors of October 7th, perpetrated by Hamas and Hezbollah. In that, the whole issue of anti-Semitism and genocide, there was some of that sort of talk in Vietnam, but and Vietnam really divided this nation in a way that it's still divided in many ways. But in the Vietnam era, the anti-war movement was really pretty sexist. And in some respects, the anti-Israeli movement has elements of anti-Semitism to it. Not the vast majority of people who oppose what's going on there are just infuriated by Netanyahu and what that government is doing, not by, not blaming it on Jewish people, and nor should they ever. But that's another way that things are somewhat similar and somewhat different. I teach at Vanderbilt University every other year for a semester. And I was there during the protests at Vanderbilt where several students sat in the chancellor's office. And my favorite student was expelled, because he had, when they went into the chancellor's office, there was a security guard who was pushed back a little bit. And my feeling was that it sort of reminded me not of William Sewell, but of the fact that in that era, a lot of administrators really didn't know how to handle it. And I think that happened to some extent this time too, where they weren't using really smart methods to deal with what was going on, and were sort of overreacting in some cases, out of political fear to some extent. And of course, political fear is what moved Johnson in many ways to keep going with the war. He didn't want the Democrats to be defined, as they so often were, as weak, right? So you see fear as a motivating factor all too often in political life.
Perhaps one more question. If anyone has one? Any of the students have a question? Yeah, I saw a hand go up.
Ever since I read your book when it came out, and it profoundly affected me because I was a year ahead of you at Wisconsin. I've often thought, and I'm wondering if you had the same feelings, that a lot of the polarization I see in our country growing today brings me right back to our generation at that time. And I think of Nixon and all of that, and I'm wondering if you ever felt the same thing.
Well, one of the paradoxes is that Trump's most popular with the baby boom generation. It's people over 65 are his biggest cohort. You wouldn't expect that, right? If those are the people that, came through the 1960s. I think, I want to get back to another, but I agree. I think the divide started in that period, and it's still there in so many different ways. Another similarity, and I sort of touched on this with the college administrations, in both here and in Vietnam, there was a certain betrayal of the younger generation by the older generation. And I think that was a profound effect in both places.
Perhaps, all right, we'll make this the final question then.
Hi, my name's Javin Sears. I'm a student here, UVM, grew up in Vermont. I just wanted to quickly ask, in the summer I was in southern Vermont, and at a gas station, I ran into this guy who was just walking out of the gas station. I was just being polite, and I was introducing myself, and he actually gave me, he told me he was a Vietnam veteran, and he, in a span of just 15 minutes, he told me countless stories about his traumatic experience in Vietnam, multiple instances, and how in his current day of life, he was living with every night, almost nightmares every night, not be able to, provide for himself financially. And he mentioned, this is where my questions comes in, but he mentioned about how just recently only, I'm not sure if the past 5 years or last year or so, that, he was actually finally granted financial from the government. And at that, I'm not sure, that's my question I was gonna ask is, were a lot of these veterans who, after the war, they got out, were a lot of them financially being stable, provided by the government? And has that changed in recent time?
Senator Leahy could probably answer that question better than I can.
I was gonna.
Or Senator Welch. But let me just say that it took a long time for any sort of reconciliation with what those soldiers endured, for the government to start helping them. And it was, Senator Leahy was largely responsible, or a key factor in that. One of the things that I discovered was that almost all of those soldiers came home and didn't talk about it. And to their families, that was true in World War II as well. But sometime in the early 2000s, the internet started to connect them again. And they found, common ground, meeting and reunions and all of that, but they'd buried it for decades until then. And so it doesn't surprise me that soldier would tell his story. Now, I came along right when they were really ready to talk. But many of them talked about how they felt that they were never given, what they deserved from the government, both financially and in other ways, and the way the Veterans Administration was treating them, the way the government was denying that Agent Orange had any effect on them when they knew it had, the way the government had lied. Even those who still had supported the war, many of them arguing that they had to, otherwise they couldn't justify their other people dying. So they thought the war had to be worthwhile because they couldn't accept that thought. But even they, many of them were angry about the way the government lied during that period.
Well, thank you all for your